Alastair, do you want to give us a bit of an indication of what the problems are in the field of energy, and then perhaps go on to outline what you think some of the solutions might be?
So when we talk about energy, we're talking about the ability to do work. That's to move something, whether that's lifting materials up with a crane or in terms of the body, moving around and cells being able to flex so our muscles work. Energy essentially is life. Without energy, there is no life. Energy can't be destroyed. It can just change its form. So when we think about the energy in an economy that drives our economy, we often think about things like the national grid and the electrical system that delivers to our homes and our businesses. We think about energy in terms of fuels, that fuel transport predominantly, but also for heating. So there are a variety of different forms of energy. I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think we're going to focus more on the production of energy for electricity, which I think is a lot of the focus of where Ed Miliband is talking currently. And I think the first thing to remember is that in an electrical grid, production and use of electricity has to be balanced perfectly at all times, ironically, to the millisecond. So historically, we know recently we just passed a milestone where for the first time in something like 150 years, we didn't use any coal to generate electricity. And there was a big celebration of that fact. But nevertheless, fossil fuels did serve a purpose of providing what is called dispatchable power. That means that the instant there was a demand for energy, that energy was available by virtue of the fact that we burnt coal or oil or more recently gas. And ironically, going backwards, burnt wood, which is what we're doing in one of our major eco-friendly energy plants, which is Drax up in the north of England.
For anybody that can't see, you just did some, what do you call those?
Inverted commas.
Yeah. What do you call those when you do that with your hands?
Air
quotes, right?
Air quotes, yes.
For air burning wood, you said it's eco-friendly.
Yeah. So we could come back to that. But essentially, dispatchable power means that when you go to turn on your light switch, or you turn on the baby monitor, or you turn on the life support system, or you turn on the power in the factory, the energy is there. Now, as we move increasingly to intermittent sources of energy, be it solar or be it wind, the balancing act that the national grid has to perform becomes ever more difficult. And there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, obviously you only get solar power when the sun shines, so you get nothing at night. Number two, you only get wind power when the wind blows, and it has to be over a certain speed. And the optimal speed for those wind turbines will vary. So the optimal power comes at around 35 kilometers per hour, which is actually quite fast, but quite common in the North Sea. But obviously then you've got to be able to plant those things in the North Sea. So you've got a whole range of different power sources now coming into the grid, and those need to be connected, and they're very, very diffuse. So whereas in a traditional grid, you've got concentrated sources of 1, 2, 3 gigawatts, in a distributed system, you need to have more cables going to more resources. Just imagine one of these giant arrays out in the ocean, and the giant copper cables that have to go to every single turbine and then to a central repository and then back on land. So there's a whole infrastructure that needs to be built out. And there's a lot of problems with that, because oftentimes where the wind blows most strongly is further away from centers of use. So the big conurbations are big cities, and there are transmission losses of that energy. So you've got the distribution of it, you've got the intermittency of it, and therefore the need to balance exactly and precisely every single millisecond of every single day, week, month, year. Without that, the grid falls over. And just like when a fuse trips in your house, a similar thing happens at a national level, and entire blocks of the grid can fall over. Now, most of the engineers will tell you that so long as you've got at least 50% dispatchable power, then these fluctuations can be somewhat managed. It's a little known fact that something like up to 25% of the electricity we use is not generated in the UK. It's generated in Norway. It's generated in Holland. We even have interlinks through to Ireland, but we have a lot through to the French. So we can link into the French grid, which is overwhelmingly powered by nuclear. And the number of grams CO2 produced per kilowatt hour in the French system is an order of magnitude below the cleanliness of the British grid, which itself is at least twice as clean now as the German grid, because in closing their nuclear power plants, they've reverted to using the dirtiest form of coal in the world, known as lignite. So we've got this tension between the percentage of power produced in a dispatchable manner and the amount of energy that we require. Typically, we're looking at something like 30 gigawatts in summer and evenings, going up to 45 gigawatts in the winter.
Can you just explain how that works, how the grid works? When you talk about wind, we don't. Wind energy is no good when the wind's not blowing. I think a lot of people will think that energy is created and then we can use it whenever we like.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly difficult to store electrical energy. Obviously, we can do it in batteries, but batteries, if you think of all of the money that's gone into batteries over the last few years, we've probably got a couple of minutes of storage in battery form. That's it. Maybe 2 minutes. In California, they've spent billions and billions, and I think they've got about 30 minutes storage. If you think that there are periods in the winter when the wind doesn't blow at night, you might need weeks or months of storage. Well, there's not enough copper in the world to create this, and we would have to mine as much copper in the next 15 years as we have done in the previous 5,000 years, and all of the high-grade ores have already been tapped. So we're having to mine ever more quantities of useless rock in order to extract copper and all the other minerals. Now, you can use aluminium somewhat, but again, that's very energy intensive to produce. The thing about the grid is, as I say, you have to balance production exactly with usage other than batteries. Now, we talked a little bit about lithium-ion batteries and banks of old second-hand car batteries. You can also store energy in potential forms, and we do that with what's called pumped storage systems. There's one up in Norwich in North Wales, where famously you've got a high-level lake and a low-level lake, and at the FA Cup final, when everybody goes to make a cup of tea at halftime, there's a surge in demand, and they release the water through the turbines, and that starts to turn the turbines, which generates electricity. In a traditional fossil fuel plant, you would be burning fossil fuels at all times, keeping those turbines spinning. The fossil fuels heat up water, which creates steam, which drives the turbine. That's going on at all times. So when they say wind power is the cheapest form of electricity, what they're not accounting for, that in the background, you're still burning fossil fuels for the moment the wind stops or the sun goes in.
Just before you move on from batteries, though, Alastair, that we are building some new kind of battery farms, aren't we? I think we're building one near York and perhaps one near Wolverhampton. Yeah. Will they not be part of the solution?
Drop in the ocean. It's a drop in the ocean. It's like throwing a cup of water into the Atlantic Ocean.
Okay.
Because the quantity of electricity we're using gigawatts every single second, and these are kilowatt battery sets. Even the biggest ones in the world in South Australia, where they've got banks and banks of what are called megapacks made by companies like Tesla. It's literally a fraction. And people's idea that somehow batteries could store wind power and solar power, it's for the birds. It really is. So what they're relying on is that the intermittency problem is solved through a sort of statistical thing that the wind is blowing here, but when the sun is in here and so forth. But what they don't account for in any of these is it's perfectly plausible that scenarios will occur that could last for days on end, where the wind is not blowing and the sun is largely obscured, obviously at night. What's the plan? What's the plan? And that's the question that the folks who advocate for more and more renewables never ever address. They say it's cheaper, but it's only cheaper in that moment when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. but they never account for the cost of having to build a complete backup system, which we could just use anyway without the intermittence.